Is it normal for 9 people to vanish in the middle of the wilderness without a single clear explanation? Is it normal for trained hikers to cut their way out of their own tent and run into a deadly blizzard half-dressed? Is it normal for investigators to arrive and immediately seal half the evidence behind classified Soviet files? What happened on Dyatlov Pass was not an accident. It wasn't panic. It wasn't weather. It wasn't human. And the deeper you look into the official reports, the autopsies, and the missing pages, the more you realize one truth. Someone didn't want the world to understand what really happened that night. Tonight, we open the file they tried to bury for more than 60 years. On the evening of February 1, 1959, the temperature on the eastern slope of Kholat Cycle dropped below -25 degrees Celsius. The winds were so strong that the snow lifted off the ground like a white curtain, swallowing the entire mountain. Yet inside a single tent pitched on that frozen slope, 9 hikers sat shoulder to shoulder, writing in their journals, boiling water, repairing gear, and preparing to sleep. Their final night. These were not ordinary travelers. They were experienced mountaineers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, people trained to survive the worst conditions Russia could offer. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, had completed countless expeditions tougher than this one. Nothing about that evening suggested disaster. In fact, their photographs from just hours before show them smiling, joking, and posing with the flag they planned to raise at the mountain's summit. The group was tired, but confident. Weather was brutal, but manageable. And their last diary entry described the campsite as comfortable despite the storm. So, what changed? What could have happened in the darkness of that night that made 9 rational, disciplined hikers lose every bit of control and escape their own shelter in a panic so extreme that they didn't even take their boots? Around 9 p.m., the wind intensified. The mountain was shaking with long, low groans, the kind of sound the Urals make when ice cracks beneath the snowpack. Somewhere in the distance, something flashed. Several hikers reported seeing orange lights in the sky earlier that week. No one knew what they were. Inside the tent, the group kept a small stove burning. They cooked the last of their dinner, laughed about the weather, and joked about Dyatlov's legendary snoring. At 10 p.m., the tent was sealed for the night. And then, something happened. Something powerful enough to force all 9 of them to cut through the inside of their own tent fabric, a move no trained hiker would ever consider unless their lives were in immediate danger. The official investigation later stated that the cuts were made from the inside. Whatever caused their panic was close. Extremely close. But here is the question that has haunted investigators for 65 years. What could terrify 9 experienced hikers at the exact same moment? Not a bear. Not a storm. Not human attackers. There were no footprints except their own. Whatever they encountered that night was something investigators never managed to explain. As the temperature plunged and the wind screamed across the mountain, the group fled into the darkness, scattered, confused, and completely unequipped to survive the night. This was the beginning of the mystery. The beginning of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. The rescue teams reached the campsite on February 26, almost a month after the hikers vanished. The first thing they saw was the tent. It wasn't collapsed. It wasn't blown away by the wind. It was cut open, long, deliberate slashes running from the inside out, like someone had crawled or clawed their way to escape. Snow had drifted over much of it, but the pattern was unmistakable. 9 people had fled in complete panic. No boots. Barely any clothing. No sense of direction. As the search party looked around the tent, they noticed something even stranger. Multiple sets of footprints, all of them belonging to the hikers, leading directly downhill. No other tracks. No signs of struggle. No dragging. Nothing. But halfway down the slope, the print suddenly faded into the snowstorm. The rescuers followed the trail for almost a kilometer, until they reached the edge of the forest. And there, beneath a tall cedar tree, they found the first two bodies. They were dressed only in underwear. No boots. No jackets. Just torn, frozen clothing. Their hands were burned. Their fingertips were blackened. And the bark on the cedar tree was torn in long vertical streaks, as if someone, or multiple people, had desperately tried to climb it in the dark, perhaps to escape something, or to look for something. Nearby, the rescuers found the remains of a small fire. It wasn't enough to keep anyone alive in -25°C conditions, but it showed that at least some of the hikers survived for hours after fleeing the tent. A little further into the forest, the next three bodies were found, Dyatlov among them. They were lying face down in the snow, positioned as if they had been crawling back toward the tent. Toward safety. Toward warmth. But they never made it. Their clothing was still intact, but their faces were frozen in expressions of exhaustion and terror. Dyatlov's arms were stretched out toward the direction of the tent, as if he had collapsed mid-crawl. But it was what they found last that shocked investigators to their core. 2 months after the initial discovery, the remaining 4 hikers were located in a ravine deeper in the forest, buried under 4 meters of snow. These bodies were different. One had a crushed skull, the kind of impact force equal to a car accident. Another had shattered ribs, but no external damage, as if the force came from inside. One woman was missing her eyes. Another was missing her tongue. And yet, there were no signs of an avalanche. No evidence of a struggle. No footprints from anyone outside the group. Then came the detail that changed everything. Some of their clothes were radioactive. The fabric emitted levels strong enough to raise suspicion, but not strong enough to indicate a nuclear disaster. Almost as if the clothing had been exposed to military material, or experimental substances, before the hikers died. When the autopsy reports were completed, investigators realized something. The injuries did not match any known natural cause. Not an avalanche. Not hypothermia. Not an animal. Not human attackers. Something happened in that forest at night. Something powerful. Something sudden. And something investigators were never allowed to fully describe. This was no longer a simple rescue mission. It had become a classified mystery. When investigators returned from the mountain with the bodies, they expected a routine forensic process. Instead, they were met with silence. The Soviet authorities took control of the case instantly. Not gradually. Not after reviewing the evidence. Instantly. The lead medical examiner, Boris Vozrozhdeny, later stated that he was ordered not to write certain details in his reports. Several injuries, he said, should not be described publicly. Some pages from the investigation journal disappeared entirely. Others were rewritten. And several photographs taken at the crime scene were never released. Witnesses who had seen strange lights in the sky that night, bright fireballs moving silently above the forest, were told their reports were irrelevant. But those descriptions matched multiple military test files declassified decades later. There was even a rumor that pieces of metal debris, found near the ravine where the last bodies were discovered, were quietly removed by officers and never catalogued. Why? What were they hiding? Decades later, when parts of the case were finally reopened, researchers noticed something disturbing. A significant portion of the evidence, especially from the last 4 bodies, was missing. Not lost. Not misfiled. Removed. Autopsy experts who reviewed the surviving notes said the internal injuries, crushed ribs, collapsed chests, skull fractures without external trauma, were consistent with a shockwave or high-pressure blast. But not the kind produced by conventional weapons. Some suggested a rocket test. Others believed it was a secret military experiment. A few theorized an encounter with something non-human, or at least, not documented in any official file. But the most unsettling discovery came from the hiker's own camera. One of the final photos, known today as frame 33, shows a blurred, glowing shape in the sky. Whether it was a flare, a rocket, or something else entirely, no one can prove. Because the negative is missing. In 2019, Russia briefly reopened the case. But their conclusion, a slab avalanche, didn't match the physical evidence. It didn't explain the tent cuts. It didn't explain the burns. It didn't explain the broken bones. And it certainly didn't explain the radioactivity. So the question remains. If this was an ordinary mountain accident, why did the Soviet Union spend decades hiding the files? Why were witnesses silenced? Why were pages removed? Why were photographs destroyed? Why did every investigator who came close to the truth suddenly disappear from the report? Something happened that night. Something powerful. Something the world was never meant to see. And until the missing pages, the missing photographs, and the missing truth are finally revealed, the Dyatlov Pass incident will remain one of the most terrifying mysteries ever buried in the snow. For more than 60 years, investigators, scientists, soldiers, and journalists have tried to explain what happened on that frozen night. But every answer only creates more questions. If it was an avalanche, why were there no avalanche patterns, no displaced snow, no trauma that matched a collapse? If the hikers panicked from the storm, why did they walk in a straight, organized line toward the forest instead of scattering in confusion? If this was hypothermia, why did experienced mountaineers slice open their own tent, their only protection, instead of putting on boots and jackets first? If animals caused the injuries, why were there no bite marks, no torn flesh, and no predator tracks? If the missing tongue and eyes were caused by natural decomposition, why did it happen only to one hiker, buried deep in snow, protected from scavengers? If the radioactivity came from old equipment, why did only certain pieces of clothing emit abnormal levels? And why were those clothes mostly worn by the hikers with the worst injuries? If the fireballs in the sky were just military tests, why did the Soviet Union remove reports, censor witnesses, and order investigators to seal the case? And if all of this has a simple explanation, why do so many pages of the original file remain missing? To this day, the closer you look at Dyatlov Pass, the less the story makes sense. What terrified 9 people at the exact same moment? What made trained hikers flee into a storm that guaranteed their deaths? What caused injuries comparable to a shockwave, without destroying the surrounding environment? What was powerful enough to crush ribs, without leaving external wounds? Was it a military experiment gone wrong? A classified weapon? A rocket test hidden under layers of denial? Something environmental we still don't understand? Or something far stranger? Something the Soviet Union believed the public could never accept? Whatever happened that night, the truth is still buried somewhere on that mountain. In the collapsed tent. In the missing negative from the camera. In the clothes that tested positive for radiation. In the autopsy notes that were rewritten. In the final footprints that simply fade into the snow. And maybe in the pages that vanished from the official archive. Until those pages appear, if they ever do, the Dyatlov Pass incident will remain a wound in history. A mystery that refuses to die. And a question that keeps echoing across the Ural Mountains. What did those 9 hikers see? And why was no one allowed to tell the truth?